Hello, welcome listeners to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love hosted by Richard Osler. Just some housekeeping stuff. This podcast started 8 years ago in 2018, and I sent a tweet out to find someone to help me put these podcasts together, and Tom Garbett, who was finishing up high school, offered to help me, and Tom Garbett's been with me the whole time. He has moved on to a professional career and lives on the East Coast, but he was in town this week and upgraded my equipment after 8 years on the same equipment with a new mic, a new soundboard. And if it sounds different to you, that's because of Tom. And he's also set us up to go on video. So at some point, we're going to start video recording these podcasts and putting them on YouTube, as well as pulling all the old episodes onto YouTube. So everything on Listen, Learn, and Love will be on YouTube because we're really committed to continuing this podcast. And that's because we have great guests like Greg Prince. Welcome to the podcast, Greg.
Thank you. It's very nice to be back.
This is episode 2 that Greg is recording. He did episode 1. It was episode number 884. And the title of that podcast is Gay Rights in the Mormon Church, Episode 1. And Greg went through in his book, that's the name of his book that's written. We'll put that in the show notes. I encourage you to read it. He went through the history. He's a historian. He wears many hats. And he went through the history of the church going from the behavioral model to mostly the biological model, starting with Spencer W. Kimball being the first church leader to talk about homosexuality. And now we're going to tap Greg's brain to walk us through the legal efforts, history that started. I'm going to read a couple of titles of his chapter. Hawaii is chapter 6. Chapter 8 is Proposition 22. Chapter 11 is the Constitutional Amendment. Chapter 15 is Proposition 8. And he'll go through all of that history, which is fascinating to understand. Nobody understands this that I'm aware of as well as Greg Prince, and he's written for it in a very thoughtful, fact-based, lots of footnotes, just going through the history. And I love knowing the history of this because when we know where we've come from, it opens to my mind to where we can possibly go to better support queer Latter-day Saints. So Greg is joining us from his home in Maryland. He's a frequent guest, and I'm on the other podcast that I love, and I'm going to say that name of that podcast right for my friends Jim and Ian. It's the Inside Out podcast. Is that correct, Greg?
That is correct. And I just recorded 2 nights ago my 30th episode on that.
And tell us, just for our listeners that want to tune into that, you're talking about a roadmap. Introduce why you keep coming on, because it's not like you've got one subject you talk about. Tell our listeners what you're talking about on that podcast.
About a year ago, I think I had too much spare time for a brief period. And I started to jot down things about the church that I thought we could improve. And the list kept growing, and I kept fleshing it out. I just gave it a working title of A Roadmap for Improving Mormonism. And after, I think the second time I was on Inside Out, I just mentioned to Jim and Ian the existence of this. I sent the manuscript to them. It's never been published. And they seized on it and said, can we keep coming back to this? Then a few months ago, again, having had a brief period of too much spare time, I about tripled the size of it. So it's now about a 200-page document, and sent them 2.0. So now they're feeding off 2.0, and who knows how long it will go. But the whole point of it, Richard, is aligned with the point of your podcast. It's trying to make this religious tradition better for everybody. But you can only do that if you can identify, number one, what can be fixed, and number two, how to fix it. Fixing it is often beyond our control, but numbers 1 and 2 are not beyond our control.
I have loved reading that and or following your episodes. I don't want to get too sidetracked on that, but one of the most fascinating episodes, and I've only listened to about 5, is Word of Wisdom 2.0, and you going through the history of the cultural context when Joseph Smith, you know, Doctrine and Covenants section 88 or 89, I always get confused.
89.
89, and just went through the historical context and lots of things that aren't addressed in the Word of Wisdom, like prescription drugs, and just your thoughts of what Word of Wisdom 2.0, I think that's what you called it. It was really insightful, the historical context and just what's possible with ongoing revelation. And so that's, listeners, is kind of a one topic in Greg's, this manuscript that he continues to share with Jim and Ian on Inside Out. And I encourage you to check out that podcast and hear Greg, Ian, and Jim's thoughts on that. Anything more on that before we talk about the legal history?
No, let's jump in.
Okay, you're on.
Probably not cover everything we think we're going to cover.
And listeners, this will probably be number 2 of 3 episodes. So I think we'll do at least 3 episodes with Greg.
Sounds good. Let's go.
Let's go. So talk about Hawaii or wherever you want to talk.
Well, there are 2 big issues within the LGBTQ world. One is gay rights in general, where that whole sector of our society was hidden, was closeted for centuries, largely because the rest of us folks, the straight folks, made it a dangerous place for them to come out. It wasn't until the 1990s that an issue within the issue, meaning gay marriage, or as often has been named, marriage equality, came to the forefront as a dominant feature within the overall gay rights spectrum. There had been attempts going back to the 1970s to try to adjudicate laws banning same-sex marriage through the courts. And this would happen when a gay couple would apply for a marriage license, knowing that they would be declined, that they would then file a lawsuit challenging the law, because they knew they weren't going to get change by prevailing on state legislatures. The courts, to them, would have been a much easier passage. The problem was that for 2 decades, any of those cases, and there weren't many, didn't even make the first step in the judicial process. They were dismissed by the judge on summary judgment. What that means is that if a judge feels that a case just has no legal merit, that judge can say, we're not even going to allow this to go to trial, end of story. And that happened several times. What was different in 1990 was that a feature of the Hawaii state constitution made sex a protected class. That's a legal term, but when anything is given that designation, it has legal standing that it would not otherwise have had. So if a same-sex couple wished to get married in Hawaii and were turned down, they could file a lawsuit not just saying, hey, this isn't fair to us. They could say, this is contrary to the state constitution, therefore we believe we have standing to bring this case to trial. And that, in fact, is what happened. Now, it wasn't a groundswell. In fact, it was just the opposite. For most people in the broader gay rights movement in the years running up to the early 1990s, there really wasn't any desire to push for marriage equality, in part because most gay couples just didn't even think that marriage was a possibility or something that was appealing to them. And the second is that they felt that the deck was so stacked against them that if they were to venture down that road, it might set back the entire gay rights movement. And so why risk that outcome? So when three couples in Hawaii simultaneously filed a lawsuit, it took them a while to find anybody who would be willing to back them on this. The ACLU said, no, we're not interested. Lambda Legal said, nope, we're not interested. And finally, an attorney in Hawaii who had really no litigation experience agreed to take this on. What surprised everybody was that the judge said, you're right, the state constitution does not allow discrimination on the basis of sex, and this looks like discrimination on the basis of sex. Namely, if a straight couple asks for a marriage license, it's given to them. If a gay couple asks for a marriage license, it's refused. Therefore, there is discrimination. And the state, according to the court, then had the burden of proof that that discrimination served a public interest. Now, I'm not an attorney, but there are two levels of legal theory that govern how laws are enacted and preserved. One is called rational basis. What that means is you don't have to like a law, but if it's clear that that law makes sense, like income tax, who's going to pay the bills otherwise, then you're not going to get very far in the courts by trying to challenge the constitutionality of income tax. The higher level is called strict scrutiny. And that means that discrimination can be embedded in law and upheld if the state can show upon challenge that that discrimination serves an important public interest. Example of that, state laws that would ban siblings or even first cousins from marrying each other, because there are medical issues that clearly would come into play there. And so those laws have been upheld even though they discriminate against those individuals. Are we okay so far on this,
Yeah,
Richard?
that's
I don't
great.
want to get ahead of ourselves. So when the judge allowed that to go to trial, there was a flurry of activity because a provision in the U.S. Constitution called the Full Faith and Credit Clause says that laws enacted in any state must be honored by any other state unless there are laws in that state to the contrary. So a benign example of that is if you are married in any state, including Nevada, even if it's in one of the wedding chapels on the Las Vegas Strip, that marriage will be honored in any other state and honored by the federal government. When it looked like this case might prevail, the shockwave was, oh my gosh, if Hawaii prevails, then a gay couple can go to Hawaii, be legally married, and we, whatever that we is, California, Utah, or Washington, D.C., would have to honor that marriage unless we had a legal barrier already in place. And so the action in Hawaii unleashed a tsunami of legal activity. Some states doing it through state laws. In the case of the United States government, the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, was a direct response to the legal goings-on in Hawaii. In fact, in the Republican commentary that was published as part of that legislation, it says this is in response to ongoing litigation in Hawaii. There was no ambiguity as to what was going on here. Utah passed a state amendment, I think it was Amendment 3, maybe a little fuzzy on that, that set up a firewall so that an outcome in Hawaii would not have been honored in Utah. Now, it turned out that once that case went to court, the trial judge dismissed it on summary judgment, as had been the case in earlier lawsuits in other states. But the plaintiffs appealed to the state Supreme Court. And the state Supreme Court, I think it was in 1993, said, we think that the plaintiffs have standing because the Hawaii Constitution demands that this case be tried under strict scrutiny. In other words, the government would have to show a compelling reason why the public interest would be served by forbidding same-sex couples to enter into a legal marriage. And that's when the alarm bells really went off. It's also when the LDS Church decided to jump in for the first time into this arena. And they had a strange bedfellow in the form of the Roman Catholic Church. You and I, Richard, were raised in a church where the prevailing wisdom, thanks to Bruce McConkie, was that the Catholic Church was the great and abominable church of the devil. And now here we are in Hawaii, and there is a strong coalition between these two churches. It was behind closed doors because they created a front organization called Hawaii's Future Today, so that the casual observer would have no idea that these two churches were backing this thing, not just backing it logistically, but financially as well. Now, ultimately, the courts decided in favor of the plaintiffs. In other words, they struck down the law in Hawaii that had forbidden same-sex marriage. But at the same time, the church coalition, the Mormons and the Catholics, took a different strategy. Rather than going into court, they went into the state legislature. The theory being, okay, if the courts rule that that law is unconstitutional, we'll pass a state constitutional amendment, thereby making it constitutional, which is a strategy they tried later in California, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So the trial judge stayed the order until that issue could be resolved. And what the Hawaii legislature did, under enormous pressure from the Catholic Church and the LDS Church, was to pass a constitutional amendment, and the voters ratified that amendment. That's the way it works in the state of Hawaii. So that even though the lawsuit had been successful, it was now rendered moot. And for the time being, the world was safe, at least the United States was safe from same-sex marriage. That's chapter 1. How are we doing so far?
It's just fascinating. Keep sharing.
Okay. So that's the end of that story in Hawaii until you jump forward more than a decade, and it's struck down as being unconstitutional later, but we're getting ahead of the story. The next phase of it raised just a little blip, and that was that in Alaska, a similar law was being enacted, or the issue was being adjudicated, and the church wrote out a check for $500,000 in Alaska, which turned out to be 5 times the amount that the entire support on the opposing side of the issue had raised. And the good citizens of Alaska let it be known publicly they didn't think well of this Utah-based church that was pouring money into their state, trying to make up people's minds on what they felt was an Alaskan issue. But in Alaska, the outcome was the same as in Hawaii, that same-sex marriage was still illegal. The next major battleground, now we're at 2000, so we're a decade after the first blip of activity in Hawaii. Californians who had had laws forbidding same-sex marriage felt that there needed to be a stronger bulwark against the marriage equality movement. So they put an initiative on the ballot that was named Proposition 22 that would formally embed in state law a prohibition of same-sex marriage. The church, the LDS church, was riding a wave of success from Hawaii and Alaska. So they jumped in California, but it wasn't as big a battle there as it had been in Hawaii, because even though California is one of the more liberal states in the Union, it wasn't yet on that issue. The church's role was significant, but it wasn't decisive. And when the election came, Prop 22 passed by virtually a 2-to-1 margin. So there was no way anybody could say, gee, the LDS church made up the difference here. It didn't. Prop 22 was never in any danger, if you were on the other side of the issue, of passing. But nonetheless, the church did jump in. Logistically, its role financially was more behind the scenes, but because it had learned a lesson, both from Hawaii, where it had contributed $600,000, and Alaska, where it had contributed $500,000, it now began to ask church members if they would write the checks rather than having the church write the checks. So that's 2000. That law came under attack, and a lawsuit was filed against it that was gaining some momentum. It looked like it might result in Prop 22 being struck down as unconstitutional per the California state constitution. And in 2007, in fact, it was struck down. But the anti-marriage equality forces were ready for that possibility. So they started another initiative called Prop 8, which was exactly the same wording as Prop 22. The difference was that rather than being a state law, which Prop 22 had been, Prop 8 was an amendment to the state constitution, which is what had happened in Hawaii. The legal theory being, okay, if the court said this was unconstitutional per the California Constitution, we now have an amendment that says, no, it is constitutional. And Prop 8 became the real battleground that pulled in much of the country's interest. At the time, it was the most expensive social ballot issue in the country's history, as I recall. Something like $80 million went into that campaign, about equally divided between the yes and the no sides. But behind the scenes, the church started to mobilize in a way that it had not done even in Prop 22, much less earlier in Hawaii. It felt that this was a hill that it was willing to die on. So it started to mobilize on two levels. One is that through the ecclesiastical arm, with Whitney Clayton taking the lead, and through the professional bureaucratic arm with Bill Evans of Church Public Affairs assigned to run logistics, they began to formulate a very impressive ground game to make sure that Prop 8 would pass. The early polling going up to within a few weeks of the election showed that the no on 8, which would have kept marriage equality legalized in California, was ahead by about 5 percentage points. That's when the church really put on the pressure. It had been more behind the scenes during Prop 22. It now was exposed largely because of a political action group in Los Angeles called the Courage Campaign, and an LDS attorney, Nadine Hansen, who took advantage of a provision of state law to pull the curtain back on the church's financial role in Prop 8. That state law was that, my recollection is, any contribution towards a social issue that exceeded $100 had to be registered in the Secretary of State's office in Sacramento. And those contributions were posted daily on the Secretary of State's website. It said the name and the city of the donor, and I think the amount of the contribution. What Nadine did was to start to collate that information and send it around to her network all over the state saying, anybody know these people? What they figured out was that a minimum of 50% of the yes on 8 money came from Latter-day Saints, many of whom had been leaned on quite heavily by church leaders to make, in some cases, 5-figure contributions. And some of those, unfortunately, spent their child's college fund or dipped deeply into their retirement fund because they felt this was a call from the prophet, and they responded accordingly. The church also mounted a very impressive ground game. They had phone banks. They had street signs with people picketing in public places. And over the last few weeks prior to the election, they turned the tide, and Prop 8 passed with a comfortable margin that represented a swing of about 10% from where it had been only weeks earlier. And by then, the ground game and the financial game of the LDS Church had become public enough that in many quarters this began to be known as the Mormon proposition, which is not exactly a title that the church would have been happy with and wasn't happy with. What they had misjudged was the public reaction in the aftermath of Prop 8 versus the virtual absence of public reaction after the Hawaii legal battle and after Prop 22. After Prop 22, which passed by 2-to-1 margin, there wasn't a blip of protest. After Prop 8, the response was intense, it was immediate, it was lasting. Large crowds picketed the LA temple site. That was the most high-profile one. And the response against the church in Salt Lake caught the brethren totally off guard. They just had not any idea that the backlash would be that swift and that fierce and that long-lasting. As a result of that, and it really gave the subtitle to my book, subtitle being Intended Actions, Unintended Consequences, the law of unintended consequences began to kick in. So even though they won that battle, meaning there was now an amendment to the state constitution forbidding same-sex marriage, the domino that they thought would fall one direction fell the opposite direction. And nationally, there began to be an awakening that is this really what a just society wants to do to a large class of its citizens? And even within the church hierarchy, there was a realization that this was a bridge too far. So at a very quiet level, they began outreach to the gay community in Salt Lake and began to talk to each other in a way that they had never done before. That ultimately began to show up in things like the Salt Lake City Council passing unanimously an ordinance forbidding discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in housing and employment. That was a first in Utah. And then several years later, there was, I think it was SB 294, that was a state law that's generally been called the Utah Compromise, that for the first, and I still think only time in a red state with a red controlled legislature, passed state law providing protections for LGBTQ people. It's not all comprehensive. It was only in housing and employment, as the Salt Lake City County ordinance had been. But that's, in essence, the legal history, not only of marriage equality, but how the church got involved, particularly in Hawaii, in California, in Prop 22, and California in Prop 8. Ultimately, the courts in the gay community in California, rather than going to state court, which wouldn't have gotten them anywhere because now this was a state constitutional amendment, took the suit to federal court. And a federal court in California overturned Prop 8, not because it was contrary to the state constitution, but because the federal court ruled that it was against the federal constitution. And in any dispute where it's state versus federal, the feds will win. So that overturned Prop 8 eventually, and then the dominoes just kept falling and kept falling more quickly. So that eventually, with Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, the US Supreme Court struck down all laws that forbade same-sex marriage. So talking myself hoarse on that, but that's in a large nutshell what the legal history was. Ask me some questions.
Talk about this. Your book came out in 2019, if I remember.
Yes.
Talk about what happened in 2022, where the church officially supported the Respect for Marriage Act, and I think sent a General Authority 70 to the signing of that.
Yes. I think the church realized that it couldn't have its own way on everything. This was foreshadowed by a internal document written in 1984 by a newly called apostle named Dallin Oaks. This brief said, here is the possible outcome for gay rights nationally, and it singled out same-sex marriage as of greatest concern to the church. And it said, among other things, there may be a time, though it didn't use this term, where we have to engage in horse trading. We won't be able to get everything on our agenda. So we have to start thinking, what are we willing to give up in return for gaining what we need to gain? And the one thing that they felt most strongly about was what about the church? We can extend rights to gay people in general, but we as a church do not want to be put in a position where the courts will say to us, or the legislatures will say to us, you cannot discriminate, for instance, in hiring. So what they wanted was to be sure that there were carve-outs that would protect church interest, even though extending to LGBTQ people other rights outside of the church. Are you still with me on
Yeah.
that? And so that law in 2022 expanded rights to legally married gay couples nationally, with the important carve out that religious traditions would not be subjected to those. Now, that's not unusual in our society. Just think about the church's flagship university, BYU. It and other religious sponsored universities operate in essence under a different set of rules than either public universities or private universities that are not sponsored by religious traditions. So BYU is allowed, for instance, to require its faculty to sign essentially an oath saying that they will not advocate for gay rights, and there's no legal challenge to that. And you can understand how that relates to the basic separation of church and state in American society. That's what the church formalized in that 2022 legislation. It said, okay, we'll be on board for extending rights in this and this and this, but we want to make sure that in the same legislation, it is specifically stated that our right to do whatever we want will be protected.
Yeah, it's just fascinating. I did the math on that from 1990 to 2022 is 32 years. And it's remarkable, the church's approach has changed so much. Talk about, and this is in your book, it was fascinating for me, and I was aware of Prop 8, listeners. That got on my radar map. I don't remember anything before then. I was 20 when Hawaii came around, so I could have known about that. But talk about the arguments that the church and those against same-sex marriage used back in the day that ultimately were struck down because there was no empirical data to support these claims.
Well, one of the strangest arguments, and Spencer Kimball made it and Dallin Oaks made it, is look, if we legalize same-sex marriage, in one generation, humanity will cease to exist. I don't know if they were crossing their fingers when they said that, but it doesn't take more than a few seconds of reasoning to say, so a few gay couples get married, that means that everybody else will stop having babies? It was a ludicrous argument, but it was one of the arguments put forward as to why we needed to protect traditional marriage. And there were others as well. What happened in Hawaii happened in California. Once the issue was subjected to the legal doctrine of strict scrutiny. What that meant was, okay, state of California, state of Hawaii, you show us compelling evidence that society would be harmed if there was same-sex marriage. And in both cases, they couldn't. They tried. They brought their expert witnesses in, And those expert witnesses were just dismembered by cross-examination because they could not produce any compelling evidence to show even that unmarried same-sex couples were any poorer than straight couples in their ability to have stable relationships and raise stable kids. One of the things that came to the forefront was that children raised by gay parents are no more likely to be gay than children raised by straight parents, which dismantled one of the psychological behavioral arguments that, oh, well, the only way gays can survive and thrive is to recruit. And that if you have children raised by gay couples, they will be among those recruits. None of those things held up.
It's just, that is particularly interesting to me, and just historically where we've gone often with fear-based narratives to accomplish a legislative goal. And Brene Brown talks about common enemy intimacy. You know, it does bring true belonging but it often is not fuel for real connection. And so I recognize in the political world and sometimes in the church world, we get this common enemy intimacy around a fear-based non-fact narrative framed as the sign of the last days, or Satan's confusing his children, and it's incredibly motivating. There, as you know better than I, really motivated LDS families with Prop 8. And I've wondered about some of those families that gave so much and then saw the church ultimately support in 2022 the marriage equality or the Respect for Marriage Act, and I bought into that, Greg. I didn't, I wasn't in California, so I wasn't called to do any things, but I probably would have, because I thought this is the right thing to do, and I'm standing up for truth. But I'm, and I would have bought into those narratives. One of the things that happened to me when I was trying to become an ally is I reached out to my high school friend Doug Bawley and his husband Rob Blackhurst, and I went to dinner with them right before a night of YSA interviews. And they'd been together a long time, and he started to talk about this space. And Doug said to me, he says, there's no legal precedent that you're going to be forced to perform temple sealings. And if there is any movement in that direction, I will be at front of the line protecting your church and its right to perform marriages the way it wants to. I'm just asking to be able to have protection for me and my husband, to live my life the way we want to. And light bulbs went off in my head, Greg, as I, for the first time really sat down with a couple in a same-sex marriage and recognized their respect for my way of life and just wanting the same for them. And this recruit thing you mentioned really resonates with me. There's this big fear-based narrative that gay people are out to recruit people to be gay. And we've learned back to your biological behavior, we've learned conversion therapy doesn't make gay people straight. So I don't think the opposite's going to happen either. And the data supports exactly the conclusion that the federal government came up with, is there's no, and I think of the other thing I think of is this assumption that being gay is a bad outcome. That's sort of this assumption in this whole, is being gay is actually a bad outcome. And I've come to learn that no, it's just a human outcome, just like being straight or being gay or lesbian trained. It's just an outcome. And there's nothing actually wrong with that. Every one of those people is able to contribute to society just as much as anybody else. And I think God loves them all the same. And my belief is everybody's created as intended. No one's a mistake. So we've learned a lot over those 32 years. I'd go back to any of that
for a moment, because the church tried to intervene in the court case. It wanted to join as a co-defendant. And the Hawaii courts turned them down, saying, you have no standing. But their argument was, hey, we don't want to be in the position, Richard, that you just mentioned a few moments ago, of being forced to conduct same-sex marriages. And the court said, that's baloney. They didn't use that word,
Right.
but that was the argument. They said the state confers to religious institutions the authority to conduct marriages, but not the obligation. And if you think about it, are you aware of any case where a Catholic priest has been taken to court because he refused to solemnize a Catholic non-Catholic marriage? No. Or a rabbi who didn't want to perform a Jewish Gentile marriage? It has never happened in this country. It was the straw man that religious institutions tried to construct to get their way, and the courts blew right through it. And it still is that case. There has never been a case where the government has said to the LDS Church, you must conduct an LDS, non-LDS marriage in your temple. It's never happened, never would. So it was a fallacious argument, and it got knocked down pretty quickly. And yet you still tend to hear that fear-mongering that, oh, we'll be forced to, and then fill in the blank space.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Talk about Bill Evans. Bill Evans became a friend to me, a mentor in the ally space, passed away a couple years ago. Share with our list. There's so many individual people in this story, but Bill's kind of a unique story in this broader legal picture.
Bill was a dear man. I had never had any contact with church public affairs until, I think it was the year or so after Prop 8, so around 2009, 2010 maybe. And a dear friend, Darius Gray, who you know well, said, I think it's time I introduced you to some of the people in public affairs. So he set up a meeting that he attended and I attended. It was in the Joseph Smith building, which is where public affairs is located. There were probably a half dozen people there, and Bill was the highest ranking one of them. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was that there had been some local activity in Maryland by a couple of church members who were trying to force the issue on a ballot initiative in Maryland that I thought was not serving the church well, and the church thought it wasn't serving it well either, and they shut it down. But that was my introduction to Bill. And I met with him a couple more times, and one time was not long after I had been introduced almost by accident to the founder of the Courage Campaign that I'd mentioned earlier. This was a man, Rick Jacobs, who was a gay activist in Los Angeles. I went to dinner with him and one of his friends, and they were astounded that here was a Mormon. I can explain to you the name or the meaning of that word if you've lost track of it, who was reasonable on the issue. And we became and remained good friends. Not long after that, I was with Bill, and I said, I had a really interesting encounter with Rick Jacobs, and he stiffened. And he said, you know who that is? I said, yeah, I know who that is. That was then, this is now. Because by then, I think it was 2012, so it was 4 years after the election. And that started an interesting momentum that resulted a few months later in Bill calling me and saying, I've taken this up the ladder and it has been approved. Will you and Jolene, my wife, invite Rick Jacobs and his partner to be VIP guests at the Tabernacle Choir Christmas concert and then fly out and host them, which we did.
Wow.
I had gotten to know Jim DeBacchus a few months prior to that because Bill told me that I needed to get to know him. That showed you how far this had already developed since Prop 8. The DeBackus and Evans now were not only talking to each other, but were very good friends. And Jim said, the concert doesn't start till 8. Why don't we put together an early dinner? And we did at the Alta Club. Jim did all the inviting. It was a who's who, not just of people in Salt Lake and Utah in the LGBTQ world, but he had Dustin Lance Black come up from California. He had Chad Griffin, who was the newly designated director of the Human Rights Campaign, which is the largest LGBTQ support group in the country. And he had three people from public affairs there, including Bill Evans. Well, Jalynn got in the mix and she said, let's put Bill and Rick next to each other at dinner. And then she sat next to the two of them. At the end of the dinner, we still had some time, so Jim DeBackus jumped up and pointed and said, you, stand up and just express yourselves. I wish we had had a recording of that. It was an impromptu testimony meeting. Some of these guys got up with tears in their eyes because things had come so far in the right direction since the dark days of Prop 8. And Bill and Rick each got up. Bill said, I want all of you to understand that we are here at this dinner tonight because of Prop 8. And everybody agreed. It was the law of unintended consequences. Rick got up and said, 4 years ago, Bill and I were enemies. Now we've eaten dinner together and we are friends. After Bill retired, he was invited by affirmation to be on the board of directors, which in itself was an incredible invitation, considering that he had been the one on the professional side who had led the logistics on Prop 8. Bill told me, I have to get permission, even though I'm retired, because of the church position that I had filled. That carries with it the proviso that even after I retire, there are certain things that I would need to get permission to do before doing them. So he went to the church and they said, yes, we give you our permission. And for several years, he was on the board of directors of Affirmation. So it was a marvelous transition to watch, and it was genuine on his part. He said, once I began to see the face of LGBTQ, my world changed. But he didn't begin to see that until the aftermath of Prop 8. It was just, the gays are the enemies, which is what autocrats always do. They need an enemy to stay in power. And the church had decided that the gays were the enemy, and that's what Prop 8 was all about. Once they put a human face on that, and it became, oh, Jim DeBackus, not them, then Bill's world changed, and it was an authentic and a permanent change. So a lovely gentleman. I was privileged to know him for several years. I mourn the loss of Bill. I hope we have a lot more people like that in the church who realize that their fear was not based on anything tangible. And instead of fear, they need love.
That is a wonderful story. That's one of your gifts to the space, is the backstories, the personal interactions you have. Eddie, would you like to share more of those kind of stories?
One of them that led up to Rick Jacobs. And you have to stick with me for a while to trace this thing, because otherwise you can't imagine connecting the dots. I got a phone call one day by a gentleman who said, I'm the associate dean of the School of Education at Johns Hopkins University. Now, if I just end the story there, you'll never figure it out. He said, would you be on our national advisory board? I'd never heard of this guy. And I said, I'm a scientist. I'm not an educator. He said, well, we want to have at least somebody from biotech on that board. and you were on a list of names, and I'm just making cold calls. Well, Johns Hopkins is only about an hour's drive from our home, so not a big deal to get up there. And I agreed. The first meeting I attended was the only meeting that this gentleman, who was already on the board, attended. We sat next to each other at lunch. I found out that he was a vice president for Screen Gems, which is part of Sony Entertainment, lived in Hollywood. I said, by fluke, I'm going to be out there in a couple of weeks speaking at a Methodist Mormon symposium. And he said, well, drop by the studio and we'll go to lunch. So we did. This was in 2010, but the wounds from Prop 8 were still raw there. This guy was straight, but he started talking about Prop 8, and he found out I was LDS. And he said the same thing that I told you about Rick Jacobs. It's, wait a minute, you're Mormon and you're reasonable. How can that happen? But he said, I have a close friend who is a gay activist. Would you be willing to meet with him? And the gay activist was Rick Jacobs. So 2 nights later, Rick and this guy and I had a 3-hour dinner in Hollywood. And Rick said the same thing. And that began that friendship that had so many other repercussions, including Bill Evans. Another one that was totally unrelated, I got a call one day from a guy in our stake, Washington, D.C. stake. Never met him. He said, hey, can I come over and talk to you? His name was Randall Thacker. I said, sure, come on over. He came over and we spent the evening together. He said, I am a candidate for the presidency of Affirmation. He said, since Affirmation started in the late 1970s, it has been defined primarily as a group of old gay ex-Mormon men yelling at the church. He said, if I'm elected president, I want to change that. One thing that would have changed immediately was he was not an old man. He was probably in his early to mid 30s. A few weeks later, he called again and he said, I've been elected president. Would you be willing to serve on our board of directors? And I said, if you do what you told me you would do, then yes. If you don't do that, then I would resign. He said, fair enough, and I will be doing that. So I spent, I think, 5 years on the board of directors of Affirmation. The first meeting I attended was in DC, and that's where I was introduced to another board member by the name of Tom Christofferson. When those things keep happening, I take a step back and say, maybe this isn't just serendipity. And it was not a single event. It was a cumulative thing. But let me go back even further, because the first cause of all this was the week after the Prop 8 election. So we're in November 2008. The year prior to that, there had been a 4-hour documentary broadcast on PBS called The Mormons. It was an amazing piece of work. The producer of that, Helen Whitney, lived in New York. When she was doing research on it, it was in 2005, which is when my McKay biography was published. A man at the University of Utah who had worked with PBS in prior years called me and he said, just want to give you a heads up. I just sent the galley proofs of your McKay biography to this producer in New York. Book wasn't even out yet. He said, you may hear from her. It wasn't long before not only heard from her, we spent 3 hours on the phone, that first chat, and probably a couple hundred hours over the next 2 years. I was giving her a lot of background on the 20th century church for this film. So now we're the week after the election. She called and she said, I need your help. My closest friend is Andrew Solomon, who is a gay activist, writes for the New Yorker, not to be confused with Andrew Sullivan, who is a gay activist who writes for the Atlantic. She said, he has turned on me. He is angry. He said, how could you have had anything nice to say about this evil Mormon church that helped to pass Prop 8? She said, I need your help in repairing the friendship. So that began a journey. It took a year to get the temperature down enough just by correspondence to where I could say, let's get together. I went up and met with him and I said, help me to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. What do you mean? I said, I'm on the board of directors of Dialogue. Write me an article that we can publish. And he said, okay, I'll do that. But he was under contract for writing a major book called Far from the Tree, which is an amazing piece of work. And he was behind on that. We didn't get the essay. And finally I called and said, how about I come up there and we do an interview? Which we did. And we did it in Helen Whitney's apartment. That interview was published in Dialogue, and it's an amazing interview. But that was really the initiation of me into the LGBTQ world in any meaningful way. I have a gay sister, 5 years younger than I am. That was never an issue. And it was never the entree into the larger LGBTQ world for me. Andrew was. And so you say, Andrew and Bill Evans and Rick Jacobs and Randall Thacker, all of these things happening, and there are significant things and significant people in that arena. Originally, I thought there's a book to be written about the church's role in Prop 8, because there hadn't been really much thorough research on that since that election. As I got into it, I realized Prop 8 isn't in a vacuum. You don't understand Prop 8 without understanding Prop 22. And you don't understand Prop 22 without going back to Hawaii, because that's where marriage equality really became an issue. But then the more I thought about it, it's, well, marriage equality is just part of the piece of this thing. And so that's when I made the decision that the book would have as a starting point the late 1960s, because that was where LGBTQ issues weren't born. It's when they came out into the public square and remained there. That was because of the Stonewall Inn riots in 1969. But it was that same time period that it was a milestone for the LDS Church, because in 1968, for the first time ever, there was a written policy in the church about homosexuality, but it was less than a line in the church's General Handbook of Instruction. It just listed transgressions that may result in church judicial action. And one of the things on the list was homo-sexual acts. No explanation. But that was the first marker in the sand. Within months of the Stonewall riots, Spencer Kimball, with no apparent coordination of it, published his book, The Miracle of Forgiveness. And that was really where the church entered the LGBTQ world in a significant way. Not a good way either. It was a very dark period for us. So that's meeting all these people and dipping my toe in the water and then finally deciding, well, nobody else is doing this, so I might as well jump in. That's how that book came into being.
It's fascinating just to hear you talk, Greg, and some of your character attributes that I hope all of us have and can learn to have is, you were just reasonable. You used that term a couple times, just reasonable. And what an easy thing in some ways for us all to accomplish is just being reasonable, being thoughtful. The other word I'd give is curious. You're willing to be curious and to be willing to learn and understand and change your feelings. And then I think I'm becoming more clear that Alta Club meeting happened because I forgot his name. Tell us the guy's name in LA.
Rick Jacobs.
So here's this guy that's the ultimate villain in the church's eyes, and he's the ultimate villain. And so you and Rick Jacobs, it's an impossible friendship to make on paper or in theory, but you make it because you spend time with each other. You're able to have this friendship that results in this Alta Club meeting, which is one of the most tender meetings and was a springboard to all the things you talk about that the church did in a positive way because of your friendship and this call from John Hopkins to be on their board and your point that this feels like maybe God's hands in this whole work. But it makes me want to do more. I think it's an invitation for all of us to do what Greg has done and be curious and be open to learning. And there's something about proximity and seeing a face of a group that we sometimes talk negatively about, and to see that face and how we can change. And lots of times that's parents with an LGBTQ kiddo, and they know the great heart of their youth. I love you giving a shout out. Go ahead.
I didn't seek out any of those people that I've named.
But you're willing to listen. You're willing to go meet with them.
Yeah, I didn't suggest that Bill Evans invite Rick to the Tabernacle Choir concert. That came out of the blue. I didn't suggest that we have a dinner at the Alta Club. Things happen if you're willing to acknowledge that sometimes there's an invisible hand that will nudge you. It won't necessarily push you. That's not been my experience. It's a gentle nudge. And if you're willing to respond to that, some really amazing things can happen. I couldn't have predicted any of this. And I can't take credit saying, oh, look at the grand scheme that I concocted. Not at all.
And there you are on the affirmation board, something that would have been just not possible. And shout out to Randall Thacker. When I first stepped in the space, I think he was chair of affirmation and just a really helpful, thoughtful person. And I write down some of these names, listeners. I think I need to reach out to Randall Thacker and get him on the podcast. So maybe we'll do that.
He lives in the Salt Lake area now. He had been in D.C.
Talk about Marlon Jensen's meeting, maybe in our last segment, the meeting that he held in Oakland or San Francisco post Prop 8.
What he did was to call a meeting prior to a stake conference. It was an addendum meeting. And he sent out the word that he would be willing to meet with LGBTQ people and allies. I was not at the meeting, but I certainly heard some of the reports of it. And I suspect that's where he saw the human face in a way that he'd not seen it before. That he listened. He wasn't there to preach to them. One of his colleagues, now deceased, who I won't name, infamously said on occasion, "I'm here to teach and not to be taught." Marlon was there to be taught. And near the conclusion of it, he said, "I am deeply apologetic for the pain that has been inflicted on you." Now, he wasn't apologizing on behalf of the church. He was apologizing as a human being to other human beings. That was immediately miscast in the press, and others jumped in, Carolyn Pearson being one of them, saying, no, that's not what he said. I was there. He was not trying to say this is an official apology on the part of the church. I think Marlon is one of the unsung heroes in this church. Since you bring up his name, I will connect his name to Helen Whitney's. She went out to Salt Lake and interviewed several general authorities on film for her documentary. Marlon told me after the fact that when the church found out she was doing a documentary, they approached her. And he said, we made the calculation that if we gave her unrestricted access and did not try to control the content, she would give us something we were not able to achieve in all of our own productions, and that is credibility. You know, the church has spent a lot of money for a lot of years in print media, but more often in films, television, trying to get its message out. But the reach of that message has always been quite limited. With Helen's, it was a large reach. But when she went out there, she had talked to me in advance saying, well, here are the people I want to interview. And I said, all right, I want you to add a name to that. The name is Marlon Jensen. Who's he? I said, you'll figure it out. She called me from Salt Lake after she'd done the interviews. And with reference to Marlon, she said, you need to make this man your church president right now. And I said, Helen, I would love to do that. Tell me how we can make it happen. He remains, in my mind, one of the heroes of this church, one of the most amazing human beings I have ever met. When, when she had not broadcast it yet, it was in its final stages, there was some back chatter of people who were trying to discredit the documentary before it was even broadcast, and they were within the church. She called me and she said, nobody in your church has seen this yet. Will you come up to New York and watch the whole thing in one day, and then call public affairs and tell them whatever you feel you need to tell them? I did, and I made the phone call and said, you don't need to worry about this. This is a good documentary. But when I was up there, she told me that when she was editing Marlon's interview, she and the editor were in the editing room, and they had a young gay intern who just happened to be walking down the hall, and he saw Marlon's image on the screen and heard his voice. And he kind of paused, and then he walked in the room and he leaned over and he said, I don't know who this man is, but he's authentic. That's about as good a compliment as you would get.
Wow. I feel the same way about Marlon Jensen and the good man he is. And I would have loved to see him continue to serve in the church and his voice to be heard far and wide. I wrote down, these are priceless things you share with us on the podcast, Greg. I hope you realize, for me and our listeners, these behind the scenes stories that we don't often hear are something that, you have a gift of not only sharing those, but being a part of many of those stories. I wrote down an earlier line when you met with Andrew and did that dialogue interview, and I think we'll try to find that, listeners, and put it in the show notes. But you said, help me be part of the solution. What a humble, thoughtful Jesus-like approach to pastoral situations. There's a pastoral story within here with your personal ministry and the effort to build bridges.
Well, and his response when we had the interview blew me away. He could have come out with both barrels firing. He had been so angry and so injured by the whole Prop 8 debacle. But he chose to be diplomatic. And near the end of the interview, and it's in the published version of it, he said, since John and I became married, we have experienced love that we did not think was possible. He said, I do not understand why the Mormon church or any church would want to deprive people of that level of love.
That's beautiful.
That's nailing it.
That is beautiful.
And I don't think there is an effective counterargument to that.
That is just beautiful. People are hard to hate close up. Move in, as Brene Brown teaches, and Jesus modeled so well, and you have in this work. I think that's probably good for now, listeners. The things we'll do another episode. I framed the first episode with a speech I heard from Greg Prince in San Francisco at Affirmation. And I'd love to talk more about that. He said, when the church decided this isn't a choice and you can't unchoose it, the other shoe hasn't dropped and we're in an unsustainable position. And I agree with that. That really resonated with me. So perhaps Greg will give us some more thoughts on what could happen. I'd love to have him talk about President Oaks, who's been the leading voice on this, as it was originally a legal issue, and he was involved way back in the 1980s in thinking about this and how it's, now more of a pastoral issue, and if that pivot has or has not occurred. I'd love to get your thoughts on that, as well as I'm sure we'll find easily an hour's worth of stuff to talk about.
Okay. My pleasure to be on this. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Greg Prince. So Greg Prince and Richard Ostler signing off from another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.